Use of ought to and used to in daily English conversations. Part 1. Morning coffee and old memories. Good morning, Anne. It's nice to see you again.
Good morning, James. It's great to see you too. How have you been?
I've been doing well. I was actually thinking about how much life has changed over the years.
That's interesting. What made you think about that?
This morning I walked past my old neighborhood. It reminded me of the things I used to do when I was younger.
Really? What did you used to do?
I used to ride my bicycle every day. I used to spend hours outside with my friends.
That sounds fun. I used to play in the park near my house. My friends and I used to have picnics there every weekend.
Children today spend more time on their phones. They ought to spend more time outdoors.
I agree. Fresh air and exercise are important. Parents ought to encourage outdoor activities.
Sure did. We used to stay outside until sunset.
Me too. We used to play hide and seek and football for hours.
Kids today ought to experience those simple joys.
Yes, they ought to learn how to enjoy life without always looking at a screen.
Speaking of healthy habits, I think I ought to drink less coffee.
Really? How much coffee do you drink?
I drink 4 cups a day.
4 cups? You definitely ought to reduce that.
You're right, I used to drink only 1 cup a day.
Then what happened?
Work happened.
That's understandable, but you ought to take care of your health.
I know, I ought to start sleeping earlier too.
Good idea. People ought to get enough sleep every night.
What about you? Have your habits changed?
Yes, I used to skip breakfast, but now I eat breakfast every morning.
That's a positive change.
I realize that I ought to start my day with a healthy meal.
That's smart.
We all ought to make healthier choices.
Family life and childhood. Anne, did you have a big family growing up?
Yes, I did. I used to live with my grandparents, parents, and siblings in one house.
That must have been lively.
It was. We used to eat dinner together every evening.
That's wonderful. Families ought to spend more time together nowadays.
I agree. People are often too busy.
My family used to go on road trips every summer.
Where did you go?
We used to visit different towns and villages.
That sounds exciting.
It was. Children ought to travel and learn about different cultures.
Definitely. Travel teaches valuable lessons.
James, my grandfather always said that people ought to respect their elders.
That's good advice.
He also believed that families ought to support one another.
I think that's true.
What family traditions did you have?
We used to celebrate every birthday with a large family gathering.
Nice.
My mother used to bake a special cake for every occasion.
Homemade cakes are the best.
I think families ought to preserve traditions.
I agree completely.
Traditions help us remember where we come from.
People ought to appreciate those memories.
Yes, because time passes quickly.
School days.
Do you miss your school days?
Sometimes. I used to walk to school with my friends every morning.
I used to take the bus.
Did you enjoy skiing?
Yes, I used to love history classes.
History was one of my favorite subjects too.
Students ought to learn history because it helps them understand the world.
That's true.
I used to spend hours in the library.
Really? Yes. I used to read books about famous explorers. I used to enjoy literature. Teachers ought to encourage students to read more books. Definitely. Students also ought to ask questions when they don't understand something. Good teachers welcome questions. I used to be shy in class. Me too. But students ought to participate actively. That's how they learn and grow. Exactly. Work and career. And what was your first job? I used to work in a small bookstore. That sounds interesting. It was. I used to help customers find books. What did you learn there? I learned that employees ought to be polite and helpful. That's important in every job. I used to arrive at work 30 minutes early. Very responsible. Workers ought to be punctual. I agree. What about your first job? I used to work at a cafe. Did you enjoy it? Anne? Yes, I used to meet many interesting people. Customer service can teach valuable skills. Employees ought to treat customers with respect. Absolutely. Managers ought to appreciate hardworking employees too. That's true. A positive workplace benefits everyone. Companies ought to create supportive environments. Health and fitness. And do you exercise regularly? Yes, I do, but I used to be very inactive. Really? Yes, I used to spend most of my free time watching television. What changed? I realized I ought to take better care of my health. Good decision. People ought to exercise regularly. I agree. They also ought to eat balanced meals. True, I used to eat a lot of junk food. Many people do. But now I know I ought to choose healthier options. That's great. We ought to drink enough water, too. Absolutely. I used to forget to drink water during the day. Hydration is important. People ought to develop healthy habits early in life. I couldn't agree more.
Technology and modern life. James, technology has changed a lot.
It certainly has. I used to write letters by hand. Me too. I used to wait weeks for replies. Now messages arrive instantly. Technology is convenient, but people ought to use it responsibly.
That's true.
And children ought to learn how to balance screen time. I agree. Families ought to spend time talking face to face. Definitely. We used to have long conversations without checking our phones. Those were simpler times. Still, technology can be useful. Yes, people ought to use it to learn and connect. Exactly.
Travel and future plans. Do you travel often? Not as much as I used to. Where did you used to travel? I used to visit the mountains every summer. That sounds wonderful. It was relaxing. People ought to take breaks from work occasionally. I agree.
James, we ought to plan a trip someday. That's a great idea. Where should we go? We ought to visit a place neither of us has seen before. That would be exciting. Traveling helps people grow. Yes, and we ought to keep exploring new places. Life is an adventure after all. Indeed it is. Shopping and money. Anne, do you enjoy shopping? Yes, but not as much as I used to. When I was younger, I used to spend hours in shopping malls. Really? What did you enjoy most? I used to look at clothes, books, and home decorations. It was one of my favorite weekend activities. I can relate. I used to visit bookstores every Saturday. That's interesting. Nowadays, many people shop online. That's true. People ought to compare prices before making a purchase. Absolutely. They ought to avoid buying things they don't need. Saving money is important. Yes, when I was younger, I used to spend money without thinking much about the future.
Many people do that. Then I realized that I ought to create a budget. That's a wise decision. Everyone ought to track their expenses. I agree. I used to buy coffee every day from expensive cafes. That can add up quickly. Exactly. Now I make coffee at home because I know I ought to save more money. That's practical. People ought to learn financial responsibility early in life. Schools ought to teach basic money management. That's an excellent idea. Students ought to understand saving, budgeting, and investing. I wish I had learned those lessons earlier. Me too. I used to think saving money was boring. And now? Now I think everyone ought to have an emergency fund. Definitely.
Relationships and friendship.
Anne, do you still keep in touch with your childhood friends?
Yes, a few of them. We used to spend almost every day together. That's wonderful. We used to ride bicycles, play games, and talk for hours.
Friendship was simpler back then.
In some ways, yes. People ought to make time for their friends. I agree completely.
Good friendships require effort.
They do. Friends ought to support one another during difficult times. That's what true friendship means. Exactly.
James, I used to call my friends every week. What happened? Life became busy. That happens to everyone. Still, I think I ought to reconnect with some old friends. You definitely should. Relationships need attention. People ought to communicate honestly. Trust is essential. Yes. Friends ought to respect each other's opinions. Even when they disagree. Especially when they disagree. That's a good point. Healthy relationships are built on understanding. People ought to listen more carefully. Listening is one of the most important communication skills. I completely agree. Weekend activities. What do you usually do on weekends? My weekends are quite different from how they used to be. How so? I used to spend weekends sleeping late and watching television. And now? Now I try to be more productive. That's great. I think people ought to use weekends to relax and recharge. I agree. But they ought to do something meaningful as well. Such as reading, exercising, spending time with family, or learning new skills. Those are excellent ideas. What about you?
James, I used to spend every weekend playing video games.
Really?
Yes, for many hours.
Do you still do that?
Occasionally, but now I think I ought to spend more time outdoors. Fresh air is always good. My family used to go hiking on weekends.
That sounds enjoyable.
It was. Families ought to create memories together. I couldn't agree more. Weekends are perfect for that. Yes, they are. Learning English. James and many listeners of our podcast are learning English. That's true. What advice would you give them? First, they ought to practice every day. Consistency is important. Very important. I used to think that learning a language required special talent. Many people think that. But now I know success comes from regular practice. Exactly. Learners ought to listen to English conversations daily. They ought to read books, articles, and stories.
James, they ought to speak even when they make mistakes. Mistakes are part of learning. I used to be afraid of making mistakes. So did I. But confidence grows through practice. Learners ought to focus on communication rather than perfection. That's excellent advice. They used to teach grammar differently in some schools. Yes, language education has changed. Modern learners have many resources. They ought to take advantage of those opportunities.
Workplace communication. Let's talk about communication at work. That's an important topic.
Employees ought to communicate clearly. Absolutely. Misunderstandings can cause problems. They certainly can. I used to send very short emails. What was wrong with that? Sometimes people misunderstood my message. I see.
James, now I think professionals ought to explain things clearly. That's wise. Managers ought to provide constructive feedback. Employees ought to accept feedback positively. Good communication improves teamwork.
It does. I used to avoid speaking during meetings. Were you nervous?
Very nervous.
What changed?
I realized that I ought to share my ideas.
That's excellent.
Confidence develops with experience. Everyone ought to contribute when they have something valuable to say.
Exactly. Environmental responsibility. Anne, James, let's discuss the environment. That's a topic everyone ought to care about. I agree. People used to be less aware of environmental issues. That's true. Today we understand the importance of protecting nature. Individuals ought to reduce waste.
They ought to recycle whenever possible. And they ought to conserve water and electricity. Small actions can make a big difference. I used to leave lights on unnecessarily. Many people do. Now I know I ought to be more responsible. Environmental awareness is growing. Future generations ought to inherit a healthy planet. That's our responsibility.
Advent's daily conversations. And do you think people change as they get older? Absolutely. In what ways? Their priorities change. I used to care a lot about what other people thought of me. And now? Now I focus more on personal growth. That's a healthy attitude. People ought to spend less time comparing themselves with others. Social media makes that difficult. It does. I used to worry constantly about making mistakes. Many people do.
James, eventually I learned that mistakes are valuable teachers. That's true. People ought to learn from failure rather than fear it. I completely agree. Success rarely happens overnight. People used to expect slower results in the past. That's an interesting observation. Today, everyone wants instant success. Yet people ought to be patient. Patience is an important quality.